now we have the introduction of today's speaker. I am honored that I'm honored to introduce today's speaker, Jeff McIntyre. Jeff McIntyre joined the chapel April 15th, 2018, and is an active chapel member and supporter. He is retired military, former IT director of the Bionetics Corporation, business owner, and substance abuse counselor. He is currently employed at the Valley Community Service Board, working primarily with people with serious mental illness and/or substance use disorder. He is married to Pam McIntyre, also a chapel member, a retired English teacher, and they have 2 adult children and 1 grandchild. Jeff perceives his life's purpose to be inspiring and raising the expansion of human consciousness and the elimination of unnecessary human suffering. Jeff believes that freedom is the best and surest path for human advancement. And he says, freedom is a manifestation of the highest levels of consciousness. Dependency is a manifestation of the lowest levels of consciousness. Please join me in welcoming Jeff McIntyre.
Thank you, everyone. It's great to be here. I call this teaching today the presence of God. And I'm going to be talking about it from a few different angles. Those of us who are raised Christian are taught that God is omnipotent, which means all-powerful, omniscient, which is all-knowing, and omnipresent, which means always present, or present everywhere. The whole crux of my teaching today is going to be around this presence and our awareness of that presence. This comes back to a story I've used before in teaching here at the chapel, and actually I think Pam gets annoyed listening to this over and over. But I was asked by a teacher of mine if I believed in God, and I told him, no, I don't believe in God. I know that there's a God. And he said, really, how do you know? And I said, because I was raised up in the mountains of New York, in the Adirondack Mountains. And if you put me out into the woods, in the woods and the trees and out with nature, I could literally feel the connection. I could feel the flow of energy. So I could kind of feel the presence of that oneness. And it wasn't just that, but also intellectually, I could see that a dandelion has fur on its seeds, and its seeds float on the air. And I also lived up in New York where there's a lot of maple trees, and if you've ever seen a maple seed, it literally has a wing and sort of flies along on the fall breeze all over the place. And I didn't believe that those plants have an understanding of aerodynamics. So I kind of sort of rationally, intellectually, accepted that there is some kind of guiding intelligence to the universe. It doesn't just happen. And of course, that's wonderful that went to have those kinds of experiences. But it really didn't do me much good in my day-to-day life. I was pretty off track back in those days. But also, so the teacher that I told the story to said to me, well, what if I put you in a hot parking lot in the middle of July? And I thought about that because he was right, and I'd most likely be complaining about it. I certainly wouldn't be conscious of the presence of God. I would mostly be conscious of the presence of heat. And it really brought home to me that my awareness of God and my connection to God, the awareness of my connection to God, was conditional. And and I thought more deeply about this because you know the you know being a spiritually conscious being doesn't do you much good if you're not paying attention to spirit. Um, you know, and I started thinking about this, and I thought about lots of different angles. I mostly thought about how this reflects in our lives and people's lives, and how we live our lives mostly unaware of the consciousness that created us, unaware of the consciousness that continues to create the universe. Um, and a lot of times, in my own kind of religious upbringing and own, experiences with prayers and all that kind of stuff, I kind of prayed to get God's attention, Matter of fact, we did a lot of things to get God's attention. I was thinking of everything from, St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York. The first time I walked into St. Patrick's Cathedral, I mean, it literally took my breath away. I don't know if anyone's ever been there, but it's just an extraordinarily, grandiose, incredible work of art. Um, and and literally, I remember I was probably 12 or 13 years old when this happened, and I kind of remember thinking, if this doesn't get God's attention, nothing will. You know. So if it's whether it's St. Patrick's Cathedral or the Tower of Babel, um, man has been sort of trying to get God's attention for a long time, and we're kind of taught to give all glory to God and praise God, and I wasn't really taught, at least not that I remember, to be one with God. Um, and a lot of my prayer and a lot of my interaction uh was about getting attention. It was also kind of those foxhole prayers, if you get me out of this one, I'll never do it again, kind of stuff. Um, and that was kind of my relationship with God. And even though fundamentally, I'm in favor of any kind of prayer, even if you're just praying to win the lottery, because at least it's a recognition that there's something greater than myself. Um, and when I was young, I was a very, very self-centered to the extreme. Um, it says in our doctrine here at the Metaphysical Chapel that the Christ consciousness is the mediator. Okay. Um, and the way I see that, the way I experience that, is Christ consciousness is that conscience. It is that connection between you might want to call it your higher mind and your lower mind, my physical mind and my higher spiritual mind. It's kind of the bridge between those two. And actually, and it's perfectly capable of giving me absolutely perfect guidance for the moment and for me. Um, the if I'm conscious of it. Now, we don't start out, well, I don't know if we don't, but I didn't start out being conscious of this connection. Um, I really picture spiritual growth as growth from a self-centered, selfish mentality to a more expansive, inclusive, unified consciousness. And that didn't happen overnight. It's a progression, and it's still progressing. Um, I'm still expanding, you might say. The And Paul describes it very well in the Bible when he says, at first we see through a glass darkly, and then more clearly, and then face to face. And that's kind of been my experience of this consciousness of God growing within me. The So the point I kind of think is God is present. Most of us recognize that God is present all the time. Uh, I guess the problem is that we are not. We are not present. Um, and there's been lots and lots of good things written about this. We don't live in the moment most of the time. We're thinking about the past. We're thinking about the future. We're having emotional reactions. Um, so the bottom line is that God is present and we are not. Um, Now, for most of us who are seeking a spiritual way of life, we want to love God. And love is that attribute of the mind that wants to unify. Okay. So we want to be in unity with with God. And that same spiritual teacher that gave me the parking lot metaphor um, actually told me that if I want to know how much I love God, because I asked him that question, how do you know if you love God? He said, well, look at how much you love the actual other people in your life. And that equates to loving God because that is God. Um, so part of God being present in my life is the presence of other spiritual beings, other perfectly created spiritual beings called people. There are other spiritual beings in my life. Dogs and cats and whatever. I guess you could expand it to that, and trees and rocks and you name it. Um, there is no place, there is nothing that exists outside of God. So, for most of us, especially in this chapel, are motivated by wanting to be connected to God and wanting to be present to God's presence. Um, so why do other things, how can we get distracted? You know? Well, it's pretty simple. It's because other things are more important to us than being conscious of God. And what things you might ask, and what could be more important than the awareness of God to a spiritual person like me? Well, it's all kinds of things. It's our children, our spouse, our friends, sports, church, the fellowship, and of course the big one, our phones. God forbid that we might miss a stranger liking something that we've posted. You know, that would be a catastrophe. Um, so a lot of I want to kind of touch on something. So a lot of it's just the distraction of day-to-day living, and it's the human condition. And by the way, there's nothing wrong. We are not intended, and we were not created to be living in a cave in a mountain in spiritual consciousness all of our lives. I mean, that's just not what we're created for. Okay. So being distracted by all the other things in the world is something that's part of the human condition, and there's nothing wrong with it. Now, as we become more spiritually conscious, or at least my experience of as I become more spiritually conscious, um, that consciousness becomes more and more sustainable. Um, and it's more sustainable in conversations with people. It's more sustainable in relationships with people. It's more sustainable in my work. It's more sustainable, in other words, you know, I kind of first became uh aware of the consciousness, the God consciousness within me in meditation. And it kind of just was quietness. And I would start carrying that quietness out into my life. And so I would kind of be the eye of the storm, and there'd be lots of chaos around, but I'd be at peace. And then that started to expand, and the gifts of the spirit, the wisdom, the knowledge, the connection, the oneness, the compassion, um, all these really powerful uh, gifts of the spirit started to manifest and become habitual, you know? And when those gifts of the spirit become habitual in your life, then they start being reflected in the things that you say and the things that you do and the relationships you create. And and you leave kind of a wake behind you of people who have been exposed to these spiritual gifts. Um, most people here know me and know that I'm a drug addict and alcoholic, and I used to go through people's lives like a wrecking ball, leaving a wake of of angry people behind me, you know? And and I hope today that it's kind of the opposite of that, that I leave a wake of people behind me that are better off from knowing me. Um, that's kind of my goal. One of the things I came across researching this is there was a Carmelite monk named Brother Lawrence. Some people might have heard of him. Lived back in the 1700s. And he was kind of an ordinary guy. He was traumatized by a war, experiences he had at war. Um, so he withdrew into a monastery, but he did a lot of writing, and he's had an effect on. But something he wrote here just sort of resonated with me, so I thought I would share it with you. He said, "I don't know how religious people can live satisfied apart from the daily experience of the presence of God. I keep myself retired in the depths of my soul where Christ lives. When I am with him, I fear nothing." And he called this a conversational intimacy. He had a conversational intimacy with Christ. And that kind of just resonates with me. Um, and we can all gain that kind of consciousness through meditation. And there are kind of tools, and I kind of get to the point of this teaching. Um, because just to know that God is present in our lives is okay, but it doesn't really do us much good. We really need to cultivate an awareness that God is always present. Because while I am with him, I fear nothing. And fear, resentment, envy, all these things that poison human relationships. Um, if I'm without fear, those things don't come into being. Okay. So there's really three primary tools we use: prayer, meditation, and study. Prayer, I'm going to suggest that we use it in a different way than I described earlier in this teaching with if you get me out of this one, I'll never do that again kind of thing. And use prayer to direct your mind to the presence of God or anything else. Okay? Prayer, you know, my prayer really improved a lot when I realized that God didn't really need my advice. you know, and I stopped using prayer as a way of petitioning God as if he were like the president or something, um, and really used it to direct my mind towards where I wanted my mind to be. Okay, so I suggest that we use prayer to direct our minds to the presence of God, and being aware of the presence of God makes those gifts of the Spirit available. Okay? Study, and I'm not going to suggest anything particular things to study. Some conscious people are really good at writing, like Eckhart Tolle and Ram Dass and all those guys, um, and there's just lots of men and women who are spiritually conscious that have written all kinds of great material, that can help us in our prayer of directing our minds to the presence of God. Okay? So that's just another tool to direct our minds to the presence of God. And meditation, in my definition today, which it might be different tomorrow, probably will be, my definition is the practice of being present. Yeah? And that's present to whatever is. Okay? So, so I'm actually going to ask, or I'm going to suggest that the answer to the quandary of being present, practicing the presence of God, is a matter of us beginning by changing our priorities and making all those things that are less important. Okay. Um, Mostly we need to change our priorities and make the consciousness of God more important than all those unimportant things. Okay. And it's not that our children and our spouse and our friends and all that stuff are unimportant. Um, but they're less important being who and what you truly are. And that's all I got. Thank you.